Welcome back to Bad Things in History, where the writer has informed me, again, that my ad-libs are too uplifting. This episode is a departure from our usual format. Being the history nerds we are, every now and again we stumble upon something in the real world that is strange and interesting. The Unicorn Book of 1952 Outstanding Events of the Year is the first entry in a book series that only contained 3 releases. The intention was to summarize the events of each year in an engaging and informative way. For reasons lost to the depths of time, the series was discontinued. We think these books are interesting because of how little time elapsed between the events and the publication of these books. For instance, the Unicorn Book of 1952 was published in 1953. This means that the authors were writing about events very soon after they happened. Let's look at a few events as described in the book and see how it compares to what we think about the 1950s today. Democratic Convention. In 1952, candidates were running for president. It was assumed that Harry Truman would win another term, but a challenger appeared which threatened his chances of re-election. Who was this candidate that threatened to kick Harry Truman out of the White House? The Unicorn Book of 1952 described him. The candidate then getting the most of the headlines was Senator Estes Kefauver, tall and good-looking, and with a soft Tennessee drawl. Millions had seen him and liked him on TV as his Senate Crime Investigating Committee in 1951 exposed shady dealings between gamblers and politicians. Kefauver's trademark was a coonskin cap, and it was in the ring. Kefauver won New Hampshire, beating Truman, then considered unbeatable. Later, he entered 13 primaries from coast to coast and captured 11. In popular vote appeal, Kefauver at all stages was unmatched. But the odds were against him. Democratic leaders considered him unqualified to occupy the White House. Some resented the Kefauver committee's probing into racketeering in Democratic strongholds. During the Democratic Convention, Harry Truman surprised the world and announced he would not run for re-election. He instead supported Adlai Stevenson, who eventually became the Democratic candidate for president. Kefauver lost the Democratic primary despite his overwhelming popularity. The election would be won by the Republican candidate, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Crime. Senseless violence was everywhere in 1952. Most of the crimes have been forgotten today, but the Unicorn Book made it a point to describe some of the terrible things that happened. On the campus of Columbia University in New York, July 14, an 18-year-old secretary was shot by a total stranger, Bayard Peakes, insane, self-styled genius, whose scientific theories had been rejected by the girl's employer, the American Physical Society. It wasn't just strangers that had to worry about getting killed, spouses were also fair game. Near Baltimore, on August 20th, a car rolled downhill and turned over. In the wreckage was found the body of Mrs. Dorothy May Grammer of New York. Suspicion fell on Mrs. Grammer's husband, George Edward. It was found that he had been pursuing another woman, whom he had wished to marry. On October 23, a Baltimore judge convicted Grammer of killing his wife, running her body downhill in their car to make her death look like an accident. Today, many of us see the 1950s as a time of repressive policies and widespread injustice, but sometimes criminals were allowed to go free. George Sponsler was a bank teller who embezzled money for 14 years before being caught. By juggling depositors' ledger cards, Sponsler hid his secret through 150-plus bank inspections. He might have remained undetected had not 4 cards turned up missing in the summer of 1952. Pleading guilty before a federal judge, Sponsler also bared a few background facts. When he became a teller in 1920, his annual pay was $1,080. It was $1,400 in 1927, the year he married and began embezzling to help support his family. It was only $1,900 when he turned straight again in 1941. And the president of the bank who hauled him to court, even though he confessed and repaid the $7,541 he had taken, was Sponsler's own brother. When the judge learned all this, he thundered, "The bank ought to be indicted here. for having invited Sponsler to steal by keeping him a virtual pauper for at least 22 years. Sponsler walked out a free man, bewildered but grateful. The biggest crime story of the year in the United States, anyway, wasn't any particular tale of murder or corruption. It was the numerous prison riots that erupted due to poor living conditions. All told, the year saw no less than 22 riots in 18 prisons. If the spark had died down by year's end, it was only temporarily. The underlying causes remained: bad treatment, bad food, unfair parole methods, problem inmates, psychopaths, four-time losers, overcrowding. For example, Southern Michigan State Prison, which was built for 5,000 inmates, was jammed with nearly 6,500. All of these conditions could be corrected with time, patience, and money. But in 1952, for an enlightened penal system, the U.S. too often substituted tear gas, clubs, and guns. In addition to political corruption and crime, the Unicorn Book of 1952 also had a lot to say about racial issues. Race relations. In the United States, racism was a fact of life. Sometimes the democratic process only made it worse. On February 16, in the all-white Southwood district of South San Francisco, California, residents held an information election. The proposition: shall the Shangs stay? Xing Shang, 26, airline mechanic and former Chinese nationalist intelligence officer, wanted to settle in Southwood with this Chinese-American wife and small son. But some of their potential neighbors objected, so Shang suggested an election on the theory that everybody really believes in democracy. The vote was 28 yes, 174 no. 2 days later, as outraged messages poured in from the country, the South San Francisco City Council deplored and disavowed the election result, but the residents of Southwood had spoken. The Shangs did not move in. While white people in San Francisco fought to keep Chinese out of their neighborhoods, in the Deep South, racists did their best to keep African Americans from attending white schools. The Ku Klux Klan was heard from. In July, in Florida, it announced the formation of an American Confederate Army to fight, if necessary, against federal attempts to ban racial segregation in that state. That same month, in North Carolina, 63 Klansmen were brought to judgment in flogging cases and received jail terms of 10 months to 6 years. In New Orleans, even young boys got into the business of racial violence. In November, other police were involved in New Orleans in the roundup of 9 members of a Nazi Stormtroopers Club, which had been smashing streetlights, damaging railroad cars, and throwing bricks at Negroes. The members carried swastika-decorated cards in English and German and pictures of Adolf Hitler, whom they professed to believe still alive in Argentina. In their headquarters, an abandoned store, were 2,000 rounds of ammunition, 36 knives, a rifle. The members' ages, 13 to 15. However, not every interaction between the races was violent. Sometimes otherwise prejudiced people could change their ways. One morning in April, outside the mountain village of Fruta, Colorado, a pickup truck carrying 12 persons braked suddenly to avoid a collision, skidded, turned over, and killed one of its passengers, a 14-year-old girl. She and the 11 others, all shaken up and some badly hurt, comprised the family of Melvin Minter, Negro lumber worker en route from Louisiana to a new job in Yakima, Washington. When the residents of Fruta heard of the tragedy, they rushed to aid the Minters. Private cars took the injured to a hospital. One woman offered the whole family indefinite use of a house. Other women furnished the house and stocked it with food. A construction company gave Melvin Minter a job. Townspeople paid for repairing his truck, for the family's hospital expenses, for the daughter's funeral. Day-to-day life in 1952 wasn't just driven by racial hatred. Business practices also had a strong influence on society. Business. Today, we see advertising in numerous forms. It's on billboards, television, radio, and of course, the internet is filled with it. But in 1952, mass media took an unexpected direction. The charge for 4 hours of spelling out words in the sky is $6,000. Last year, Skywriting Corporation of America stopped using a single plane to form letters in wispy white smoke. It now sends up a fleet of 7 planes in tight formation. Pilots were chiefly Air Force reservists willing to pick up extra money, and all they had to do was keep on flying. The rest was handled in a control plane by an electronic mechanism which releases puffs of brightly colored chemical smoke from each of the planes. In a few seconds, these puffs form letters, and within 90 seconds, a 5-word advertising message is written out. Of course, television was becoming big business, but families that owned one had to pay dearly. In addition to requiring maintenance, many televisions were purchased on payment plans. About 5 million T-sets were made and sold during 1952. By year's end, television was in about 1/3 of all American households. Installment buying TV owners still owed $750 million and will have to pay out hundreds of millions yearly for repair and maintenance. But they loved it. The middle class was being squeezed far more than luxuries. Taxes during 1952 were also very high. At least 30% of last year's national income was siphoned off in taxes, and the cost of all government, federal, state, and local, was 3/4 of the total wages and salaries of the nation's non-governmental employees. So high are federal and state gasoline taxes that oil men proposed renaming motor fuel Taxoline. Although citizens were giving nearly 1/3 of everything they earned to the government, banks continued to thrive, and they were eager to offer convenience to car owners. Some banks now have special accommodations for motorists. An Ohio bank is building 5 glassed-in teller units in its parking lot. A Texas bank has ramps to an upper-floor parking space for 300 cars. For motorists who won't use even this convenience, there are 10 carports on the ground floor where a bank official roams, ready to negotiate small loans to auto users. While the average person struggled to make ends meet, the Cold War was just getting started. Weapons. The United States spent much of the 1950s and 1960s researching ways to create and use nuclear weapons. By 1952, there may have already been enough weapons to end human existence. The U.S. stockpile of A-bombs now was numbered in 4 figures. A whole family of atomic weapons grew up for a variety of strategic situations. A weapons were reduced in bulk and in weight, but not necessarily in explosive power. Atomic explosives were made small enough to be carried by guided missiles. Baby A-bombs were hung onto special shackles in the F-84G Thunderjet, the Fleet Republic fighter which, being refuelable in mid-air, was limitless in range. Atomic shells were made to fit the new 250mm atomic gun. In addition to unleashing the most destructive power in the universe within the atmosphere of the only known habitable planet, a lot of work was also being done to automate the deliverance of death. So fast and intricate did new aircraft become that their human pilots were obsolescent. The Air Force unveiled semi-automatic interceptors such as the Lockheed F-94C Starfire and the D model of the North American F-86 Sabre. Each fired 2.75-inch rockets rather than conventional but less legal guns and was laden with 1,000-odd pounds of electronic gear. This electronic brain, faster and surer than the human brain, picked up the enemy bomber, charted its course, guided the interceptor toward the target, and selected the instant to fire the rockets. Meanwhile, General Omar N. Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was worried that European members of NATO were putting too much faith in nuclear weapons. Bradley was worried that the NATO allies were slowing their rearmament effort because of an unjustified faith that atomic artillery and baby A-bombs were all that were needed to repair a Soviet assault. He argued that Western Europe's military leaders should be taught what atomic weapons could do if they were to use the atom effectively, and also what such weapons could not do if they were not to rely on the atom unduly. The trouble with atomic wonder weapons was that they gave rise to a false sense of safety. The Iron Curtain. As the Unicorn Book of 1952 appears to have been written by authors from the United States, it had a lot to say about the Soviet Union. Specifically, it made claims that Russia survived by stripping resources from the smaller countries around it. Apparently, some members of the Soviet Union fared better than others. Imports from satellite nations helped Russians eat better than people of most European countries during 1952. If the Soviet way of life was improving, how was this being accomplished? Russia had had to repair war damages, produce arms at a rate higher than ever before, draw labor from farms to factories to meet higher industrial production norms. And she had had to send millions of tons of grain abroad to help embattled communist China and to get rubber and machines from Britain. One answer to the question of how lay in the dismal conditions in the Soviet satellites. Caught in the Kremlin ringer, the so-called People's Republics, normally self-sufficient, bitterly watched freight cars of produce rumble eastward, loaded and come back empty. The people living in these conditions didn't always accept starvation willingly, but according to the Unicorn Book at least, there was little they could do to stop Russia from taking what it wanted. In Poland, after February 15, the government used force to compel deliveries of beef cattle. The Ministry of Agriculture admitted that more than 1 million farmers had been holding out against voluntary contracting with the government. On April 1, the day food prices dropped in Moscow, food rationing was tightened in Poland. Food riots punctuated the rest of the year, growing more intense by November, when the potato supply dropped to 40% of the country's needs. It wasn't just food that was stripped from these countries. Poor families were forced to live with the bare minimum in nearly every way. In November, a Polish housewife wrote to Radio Warsaw, "We have so many coal mines, yet coal is rationed. Where is it all going?" The answer? For the great construction of socialism. Next question. In Bulgaria, the Ministry of Electrification rationed light bulbs, one to every household. In Romania, the government advised the peasants to remedy the shortage of fuel by making use of agricultural waste, sedge, and other materials. The rest of the events from the Soviet Union were not described favorably by the book, nor did it appear to find any redeeming qualities in Joseph Stalin, who would pass away in 1953. What do you think about these excerpts from this strange and almost forgotten book? We noticed a few things worth mentioning. First of all, no sources are given to corroborate the details presented as facts. We simply don't know where the authors found much of what they claim to be true. After reading the book in its entirety, it was also obvious that anything remotely socialist was presented in the worst light possible, and for the United States and Western Europe, there was a focus on positivity even when horrible events were described. So, should we do more episodes on this book series, or do you think we should leave it here? Let us know in the comments below, because whether we continue this project or abandon it is entirely up to you. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.